The stage director enters.
Last night, in this assembly, Gangesa Upodyoya put 2 of the 4 pramanas to the touchstone, perception, by which we see the conch, and inference, by which we travel from smoke all the way to fire. But Naya accepts 4 pramanas, not 2. Tonight it is the turn of the remaining 2, and those 2 are but 2 forms of a single question: how does a word reach its meaning? A child hears the word cow and looks toward an animal. Who tied that invisible cord between that sound and that animal, and how is it known? And when a word stands for a thing which the hearer has never seen, an animal of the forest, a custom of a distant land, a deity of the Veda, how then is that cord to be grasped? The first answer bears the name Upamana, knowledge from similarity. The second bears the name Shabda, knowledge from trustworthy speech. Tonight both must stand before their respective opponents. And keep your attention on that second figure placed upon the table, the animal that is like a cow but is not a cow. No one in this assembly yet knows its name. By the time the evening ends, everyone will know it, and how they will come to know it, that is the entire debate of tonight.
Gangesa is seated. A forest dweller enters and makes his obeisance.
Acharya, I have come from the forest of the north. A merchant of my village sent this message for your assembly. Yesterday, in the forest, he saw an animal which he had never seen before, and yet the moment he saw it he cried out, "This is a Gavaya." Although he had heard that word only once, a year earlier, from my own mouth, when I had said, "A Gavaya is like a cow." He asks, by which pramana did this knowledge arise in him?
And tonight's debate could not have opened more fittingly than this. Hear this story again, slowly, for 3 events lie hidden within it, and upon each of them some school will stake its claim. The first, in the village, the merchant heard a sentence, "A Gavaya is like a cow." The second, in the forest, he saw an animal and perceived in it the similarity of the cow. The third, in that very moment this determination arose, this is the animal which the word Gavaya denotes. Whence came this third cognition? Not from perception, for the eye shows only horns and hooves, not the meaning of a word. Not from the mere memory of the sentence, for to one who has never seen a cow-like animal, that sentence never yields that determination. This is the cognition which our Shastra calls Upamiti, and its instrument, Upamana.
And this is the very place, Gangesa, where your school and mine part ways, so let me speak first. I accept Upmana, but I accept more than you do. That similarity which the merchant saw in the forest, the similarity of the cow, residing in the Gavaya, what is it? It is not substance, not quality, not motion, not universal, not particular, not inherence, not absence. Into none of the 7 categories does it fit. Therefore it is the 8th, similarity is in its own right an independent category, and the unobstructed usage of the word, the cow-like animal is a Gavaya, is its proof.
A bold claim, and I shall give it an examination worthy of its boldness. Tell me first, is this similarity one, or many? If one, a single similarity recurring in all things, as a single cowness recurs in all cows, then the very similarity which joins the cow and the Gavaya would join the pot and the cloth as well, and everything in the world would become like every other thing. And what the world says, this resembles the cow greatly, this resembles the cow a little, how can there be more and less in a single, partless entity?
Then say many infinite similarities, like conjunction, each residing in its 2 substrates.
Then the second snare, more bitter than the first. If similarity, like conjunction, resides in both its substrates, then the similarity residing in the Gavaya resides also in the cow. Now place the merchant in the forest, where there is no cow, only the Gavaya. His eye touches the Gavaya, not the cow. If he sees the similarity, and that similarity resides in the cow as well, then he ought also to have perception of the absent cow, which never happens to anyone. And if he does not see it, then your perceived similarity has gone dark in the forest. Your bull is caught upon both horns, my friend.
My Kumarilas Karika gives a subtle answer. Similarity is no new category, but a collection of many shared properties of parts, of qualities, and of motions, which together are called similarity. Just as many trees taken together are called a forest. Resembles greatly means more shared properties, resembles a little means fewer.
Now you have come half the road toward my house. In saying collection you have abandoned the 8th category, but where you have halted, even there it is hard to stand. Take 2 lotus flowers of the same species, between which there is no countable difference of parts, and yet the world says, this flower is like that flower. What collection is there? And here my favorite example, which I have given in my own work, a baby elephant and a donkey. In the build of the body there is no match anywhere, neither parts, nor qualities, nor shape. And yet people laugh and say, this donkey eats like a baby elephant. What collection of shared properties is there in that? Only a similarity in the manner of eating, a single property, not a collection. Your definition does not even reach the places where the tongue of the common people reaches every day.
Then what is similarity, Acharya, if it is neither an 8th category nor a collection of properties?
It requires no new entity at all. The Gavaya is like a cow means only this. In the Gavaya there are many of those properties which are also in the cow, and yet the Gavaya is different from the cow. Being possessed of many of its properties while remaining different from it. 7 categories were sufficient, the 8th was an unnecessary guest, whom we see off from the very door, with respect, but without dinner.
The category I have lost, I concede it. But the Praman is still mine. That cognition which arose in the merchant, and beyond it, the cognition that will arise when he returns to the village, my cow is like that Gavaya, by which Praman will you deliver that? Not by perception, for the cow is in the village, and the Gavaya in the forest, the two are never before one pair of eyes together. Not by inference, for the reason of an inference must reside in the subject, and your reason, the similarity located in the Gavaya, is in the Gavaya, not in the cow. Therefore this cognition is the separate province of Upmana itself, as we hold.
Gently, friend, you have pronounced inference impossible far too quickly. Search for the pervasion, and it is found, at home. I have seen 2 elephants standing face to face, each like the other, with one and the same glance, and from that this general pervasion comes to hand, whatever is the counterpart of a similarity residing in something, is like that thing. Now erect the inference, the subject, the cow, the target property, similarity to the Gavaya, the reason, being the counterpart of the similarity residing in the Gavaya, the example, the brother elephant sister elephant. The cognition is obtained, and without any new pramana. What you call presumption, or an independent upamana, is in my reckoning an inference by difference, in disguise.
Then have you cut Upmana away altogether? The third Praman of your own school.
Precisely the opposite, I have not cut it away, I have given it its own proper work, which until this day no one had rightly recognized. And before recognizing it, I must pull down an old wall of my own house. My predecessor, Jantabhatta, used to say, the memory of the sentence and the perception of the similarity together yield the determination, this is a Gavaya, and that determination is Upamiti. Beautiful, but far too narrow. Here another story. A traveler of the south, before setting out for the north, asked, what is a donkey like there? I have never seen one. A man of the north told him, and this description is no eulogy, the lowest creature among beasts, whose neck is absurdly long, whose lips are long and quivering, who chews twigs both hard and soft, and whose body is covered with lice. The traveler reached the north, saw such an animal, and the determination arose, this is the donkey. Now apply Janta's definition. Where is the similarity? This is an identification made through dissimilarity, through a contemptible peculiarity. And without knowledge of pervasion there can be no inference either. Janta's upamana cannot stand here, and yet the cognition arose, and it was veridical.
Then what is the true work of upamana?
Gangasar lifts both the figure of the cow and the figure of the Gavaya and sets them before the assembly.
Listen carefully, for this is the fruit of this act. When the merchant in the forest said, "This is a Gavaya," he learned nothing new about the animal was before his eyes. He learned something new about the word, that the sound Gavaya is the denoter of an animal of this species. That chord between word and meaning, which we call power, that is what upamana grasped. And that chord cannot be tied to any one individual animal, otherwise the word Gavaya would not apply to a second Gavaya at all. It is tied through Gavayahood, through that species, which was recognized by the pointing of similarity. Hence my doctrine, upamiti is this cognition, the animal possessing Gavayahood is the denotation of the word Gavaya, and upamana is its instrument, the cognition of similarity assisted by the memory of the meaning of the general statement, whether that similarity be of common properties, of contrary properties, or of an extraordinary property. Among the means of grasping the power of a word, grammar, lexicon, the sentence of a trustworthy person, usage, and the rest, upamana is the one that carries you to the word for a thing which the hearer has never seen at all. This is its own kingdom, and in this kingdom it is the sole king.
You have taken my category, taken the domain of my praman, and in exchange you have set upamana upon a throne on which it had never sat before. I shall go home and ponder this bargain.
No disputant can ask for more than that. And do not leave just yet, for upon the tail of that cord of the word which I have just told rests the remainder of this assembly's evening, and the other branch of your school has come this very day to fight me over it.
The Buddhist and the Vaisheshika come forward. The lamp is trimmed.
Last night, Gangisa, I admitted defeat on the unseen maker, not a complete defeat, but an honest one. Today I have come with a simple claim, and this time the scales are in my hand. You say that the word is a pramana in its own right, that upon hearing trustworthy speech, veridical cognition arises. I say, only that is to be called a pramana which is the extraordinary cause of cognition. But even when the word is present, even when it reaches the ear, if there is no expectancy and no fitness, no understanding of meaning arises at all. Pot, fire, sprinkles, hear all three words, nothing will be understood. That in whose presence the effect remains uncertain is no extraordinary cause. Therefore the word is not an independent pramana.
Give one moment's attention to the very medium through which you sent me your claim. The word is not a pramana, this sentence is itself made of words. If it is true, then a sentence has given me veridical cognition, and the word stands proved a pramana. If it is false, then your objection has collapsed. Both roads arrive in my own courtyard. And as for auxiliaries, the eye needs light, is the eye, then, no pramana? Every instrument needs auxiliaries, the need for an auxiliary does not destroy instrumentality, it completes it. Expectancy and fitness are the word's light, not its rivals.
Then hear my attack, which is subtler than the Buddhists. I accept the word as a pramana, but not an independent one. It is absorbed within inference. The cognition that arises upon hearing bring the cow arises from this inference. This group of words is the informer of mutually connected meanings, because it possesses expectancy, fitness, and proximity, like a sentence heard before. The word is a mark, like smoke, and verbal understanding is an inferential cognition. 3 pramanas instead of 4, parsimony is on my side.
Parsimony is a beautiful argument when both roads reach the same village, but your road does not arrive at all, as I shall show. For inference, one first needs the memory of the pervasion, then the knowledge that the subject possesses the reason, then reflection, only then the inferential cognition. Now watch any child to whom his mother says, "Eat your rice." Does that child first recall a pervasion? Whatever group of words possesses expectancy and the rest is an informer of syntactic connection? Then infer the trustworthiness of the speaker. Then perform reflection. In all that time the rice will have gone cold. The moment the sentence is heard, the meaning is understood, that very instant, without any intermediate stare. This immediacy is itself the proof that the word possesses its own independent power of illumination. Where experience shows no staircase, to thrust a staircase into the theory is not parsimony but prolixity, a useless burden.
Granted. But then you tell me, a bare heap of words does not thereby become a sentence. Pot, objecthood, bringing, volition, throw down these 4 words, and nothing will be understood. What is required for bring the pot to be understood?
4 things, and I shall give the definition of each as tightly as I gave the definition of pervasion yesterday. The first, expectancy, that incompleteness of one word by which it cannot establish its syntactic connection without another word. Mark well, this is not invariable co-occurrence. In Blue Lotus neither is every lotus blue nor every blue thing a lotus, and yet the 2 words possess expectancy. Nor is it the hearer's curiosity, as certain Mimamsakas have said, a sentence is understood even without curiosity. The second, fitness, the absence of the cognition of a contradiction. He sprinkles with fire, expectancy is present, proximity is present, but fire has no capacity for sprinkling, hence no understanding arises. And the subtlety is this, it is the certainty of contradiction that blocks understanding, not the doubt of contradiction. Even while doubt remains, verbal understanding does arise. The third, proximity, the utterance of the words without delay, and the unbroken memory of their meanings. Say pot today and bring tomorrow, and the sentence has died. The fourth, intention, the speaker's purpose. In the middle of a meal, bring Saint Hava, the hearer understands salt, not a horse. The word has the power for both, but intention selects one. And where the primary meaning is blocked, a hamlet on the Ganga, there it is intention itself that opens the door of figurative sense, the bank of the Ganga. These 4 together make a heap of sounds into a sentence, just as 4 legs together make a stool a stool.
All for accepted, Gangesa, but on one deep matter my school stands apart from you, and I shall set it down here. Our doctrine is that the power of words extends only to meaning connected with action, meaning joined to a verb. How does a child come to learn words at all? An elder says, bring the cow, and the child sees the bringing, tie the cow, and he sees the tying, every time, the word together with an act. Therefore the meaning of a word is always connected with action, and a solitary word, without a verb, is meaningless.
Then poetry would die, my friend, and drama, and story, and this is not my sentimentality, it is argument. The moon has risen, in this sentence there is no task for the hearer, no command, and yet its meaning is understood, and delight arises besides. If the power lay only in the action connected, whence this understanding? And the child's schooling of which you spoke, that is one door of grasping the word's power, not the boundary of that power. Yesterday I proved Upamana, too, to be just such a door. The power belongs to each word in its own right, expectancy, fitness, and intention join them together. The words independent, the sentence conjoined, this accords with the experience of the world.
Then let us march to the true battlefield, for all of this was but its prelude. The Veda. Our 2 branches, Bhatta and Prabhakara, are one on this. The Veda has no author. No composer, never had one. The teacher-pupil tradition of recitation is beginningless, like seed and sprout, with no first link. Therefore the validity of the Veda rests upon the intention of no person, neither man nor God. It is valid of itself. And this is its glory, into a speech that issued from no one's mouth, no one's fault can enter.
A grave doctrine, and I shall not laugh it away, I shall cut it with that very weapon of yesterday which you also witnessed. First, to say beginningless tradition is not an answer, it is the postponement of an answer. Every recitation rests upon a previous recitation, and that upon the one before it, this chain is either an infinite regress or self-dependence. And that which we established last night, that the cycle of creation and dissolution turns, granted, and then in the dissolution every throat falls silent, every memory is erased. The cord of the tradition is broken. In the new creation, who retied it? Second, and deeper, for the veridical composition of a sentence, veridical knowledge of the sentence's meaning is required. Composition without a knower, utterance without intention, is like handwriting without a hand. Therefore the faultlessness of the Veda does not come from its authorlessness, it comes from the omniscience of its author. The Veda is the work of that person whose knowledge is eternal and faultless, the divine. And for any custom that is universally accepted in society but whose Vedic text is not found today, we infer a lost branch. The original injunction existed, was lost in a dissolution or in the abyss of time, and in the new creation the omniscient one teaches it again. Yesterday's inference of the divine and today's chapter on the word are two pillars of a single edifice, neither stands without the other.
One final question remains, Gangesa, and it is the oldest heirloom of my house. Let him who desires heaven perform the sacrifice. The sacrifice ends today, heaven comes after death, who carries one across this long interval in between? Our answer, an unseen potency, born of the sacrifice, arising in the self, which endures until the fruit, and it is precisely this that the injunctive suffix denotes. Will you cut this away as well?
Not cut away, put in its proper place, and mark the difference, for this is the final lesson of this evening. I too accept the need for an intermediate link, between the momentary sacrifice and the heaven of a later time something is needed, and let it be unseen, on this there is no dispute. The dispute is here, what is the primary meaning of the injunctive suffix? You say, an unseen potency. I say, that this act is the means to your desired end, and together with it, that it is achievable by effort, and that it does not entail a stronger evil. Why all three? Listen. The drinking of poison is achievable by effort, yet no healthy man drinks it, because it is not a means to what is desired. Rain is a means to what is desired, yet no one sets about making rain, because it is not achievable by effort. And a forbidden rite for slaying an enemy, a means to the slaying, achievable by effort as well, yet the discerning man does not perform it, because a stronger evil is bound to it. The knowledge of all three together begets activity, and the injunctive suffix expresses all three. An unseen potency. When the direct link appears impossible, then it is brought in, through the side door, not onto the seat of honor. The end is heaven, not the unseen potency, to give the means the throne and to stand the end at the door, that is prolixity, and parsimony, which yesterday was the Vaisheshika's argument, today is mine.
Yesterday you told the Buddhist that you had not come to win by speaking last. Today I bear witness that you have kept your word, my category, my pramana, my authorlessness, my unseen potency, all for you removed not by shouting, but by counting.
And in the place of each of the four I set something, that is the difference between demolishing and building. In the place of similarity, the possession of many shared properties, in the place of an independent opimity, the grasping of the word's power, in the place of authorlessness, the speech of the omniscient, in the place of the unseen potency, being the means to what is desired. I sent no one away empty-handed.
The stage director returns and lifts the figure of the Gavaya.
At the beginning of the evening, no one in this assembly knew this figure's name. Now all know it, and they also know by which stairs that name climbed up to reach them, a forest dweller's sentence, vision of a similarity, the grasping of a power. The tale of Gangesa Upadhyay's four pramanas is complete today: perception, inference, comparison, word, and at the end of all four, one and the same lesson returned again and again. No pramana received its throne without examination, and none was sent into exile without a hearing. The words you carry away from here tonight, the cord by which they reached their meanings was also, you now know, tied at some time by someone. May that cord never break. This is the entire prayer of this science.
All the characters depart. The lamp goes out at the last.